Okay, we're going to get started. This is Tom Hagee. I'm Managing Director at HB Conferences. This is part of a series of compliance programs we're doing with Susan Frank Divers on must-haves for compliance programs at companies. So as I mentioned, we're doing this with Susan Frank Divers. Susan is a senior advisor with LRN Corporation, and in that capacity she brings over 30 years of experience in ethics and compliance. Her expertise includes building state-of-the-art compliance programs and fostering an embedded culture of compliance. Prior to LRN, she served as AECOM's Assistant General for Global Ethics and Compliance and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. AECOM is 130,000 employees worldwide. So the fact that Susan oversaw an award-winning program for that many company of that magnitude says quite a bit. Before that, she was with SAIC and Lockheed Martin, and was a practitioner at Sonnenschein, Nath, and Rosenthal. She also spent 4 years in London as a qualified solicitor to the High Court of England and Wales. And before that, she also served as an attorney office of legal advisor at the State Department. And finally, she was a member of the U.S. delegation to the UN, working on the first anti-corruption multilateral treaty initiative. In joining Susan today are two excellent speakers. Nancy Laban is the General Counsel and Executive Vice President of Booz Allen Hamilton. Nancy leads the firm's law department, and she's a member of their leadership team. Nancy is responsible for the firm's external and government relations. This is our first time working with Nancy, so thank you, Nancy, for joining us today. And also with her is Kimberly Park, is a partner at WilmerHale. Kim's focus practices on white-collar criminal matters, internal corporate investigations, and compliance counseling. Kim also co-leads the firm's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and anti-corruption practices. So with that, Susan, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Tom, and welcome everybody, and welcome Nancy and Kim. We've all had the pleasure of working together in prior lives, and so it's really nice to be reunited with two such excellent professionals. And I will just note that Nancy's law department has again been named one of the top 100 corporate law departments. So I fully am not surprised by that, and congratulations, Nancy.
Thank you, Susan.
So turning to the topic we're looking at today, in thinking about what are some of the key topics that don't receive a lot of coverage in other fora, I think this is a good example of sort of a sleeping giant that is there and that affects many companies. It's not something that's necessarily public because informal investigations are almost always resolved outside the public eye and the press, but it's also extremely widespread. At a recent conference with about 400 people in the room, we polled and asked how many companies had been subject to informal investigations, and it came in over 70%. And so what these are informal inquiries by government regulators that usually start out with a phone call asking if the company would take a look at particular projects or particular individuals and giving some idea, many times not much, of why the government's making that inquiry, and usually a better idea of what is the concern. And we can talk a little bit about that as we launch into the must-haves. But handling these is really quite an art form, because if they're mishandled, they can turn into full-blown, even more expensive formal government investigations. And if they're handled correctly, they can go away. So with that introduction, Let me start with Kim, and let's look at the first must-have that we think is essential if you do get that call or possibly even that email from a regulator asking about something. Kim?
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, this is really, it's a trend that's been building for some time, and there's really a diverse range of investigations that are out there involving regulators. I think it used to be that the perception was you'd always get a subpoena or something, or grand jury subpoena or a civil subpoena, but what we're seeing is regulators and enforcement agencies following their leads. So they may not be ready to open a full-blown formal investigation, but they're going to follow their leads. And a lot of this has exploded after the Madoff scandal because there was some criticism of the SEC for the failure to follow leads. And with the Dodd-Frank whistleblower statute, as you mentioned, there are more leads to follow, and the government feels that they need to follow those leads. So that's where you get these informal inquiries. I think one of the key first things to consider is the context of the regulator you're dealing with. What is their pattern? Is this their normal approach to your company? Do you have a history of dealing with that same regulator or enforcement agency? Do you know whether, for example, the issue arises because there's a broader industry-wide sweep or investigation? And just to give you one example of that, the SEC has been doing a long-running investigation of a number of different banks and their dealings with sovereign wealth funds in a variety of countries. And many different inquiries have arisen from that one investigation. So getting that context, trying to figure out, are we the only one getting this question, or is this part of a broader industry-wide look at a set of questions? Is this part of a pattern of dealings with the same regulator because, for example, if you are a government contractor, you are often in communication with a regulator or enforcement agency? Is this part of something else that's going on, like perhaps a whistleblower? So I think that's part of the key question that you want to ask very early on when you get one of these inquiries.
And Kim, this is the reason that you would want to do that, of course. I think where you're heading is that helps you decide how you actually start to dive into something like this. And so as a general counsel, one of the things that I try to make sure I do is make sure I'm talking to my peers, other GCs, other folks in either my industry or who have the similar role, and talk to outside counsel to pick up that intelligence, as you say. Is this a broad-based, hey, let's ask everybody in the industry about whether or not they hire interns, or is this targeted? Also, you find out things, especially if it comes from Congress. Congress is now doing more of these informal type things as well. And so knowing, were you the only one to receive it? Were you one of four? That's very helpful in figuring out where do you go from there? How do you address it? And we'll talk a little bit more about what do you do once you figure that out.
Those are good points. And Kim and Nancy, I believe two other instances of the government targeting particular sectors. One is Hollywood studios, and the second, I think, was Libya, companies that had some contracts in Libya. Is that right? And are there any others that you can point to?
Well, I think that is right, and I think there are quite a few examples of this. I think what both of you have said is really important to understand as best you can where is this inquiry coming from? Is there someone within your company, a former employee, a current employee, that's feeding information? Is it coming because of a piece of information that the government learned looking at one of your competitors? Is there a political situation out there that is generating this that might in and of itself lead to congressional attention or attention from the press? All of that is really critical.
Right. Well, Nancy, how about if you talk a bit on the second must-have about how you actually prepare your management for this eventuality, particularly as it doesn't come in through a traditional formal legal summons. What do you do? Because obviously they can come out of the blue.
Sure. Well, this is one of those where preparation in advance is crucial. You must have a conversation with both management and the board, and the conversations are slightly different given their different roles, in advance of receiving anything like this, to talk about what is your proposed approach should something like this come across the desk in some fashion. So starting with management, one of the things that it's very important to do is to let them know, again, by educating them that these are trends that we are seeing. If I hear of broad-based inquiries, I make sure that I give them an update on a regular basis of things that's going on. I talk to them about my proposed path to handle some of the things we're going to be talking about. How do we address the scope? How do we determine if we need outside support from outside counsel, from forensic support? And so I want to let them envision the path that this could take, because if I don't do that, the whole construct of informal could suggest to them that we don't have to take it seriously. And I want to be as prepared for it as I possibly can. We also would try to think about in advance, what's our posture on disclosure? Because management and I will need to go together to the board if it's a larger matter to determine if we're going to make a disclosure. So how do we think about voluntary disclosures? And literally walking through what is your company's perspective on that, and getting the management to help define that is very important, as is helping them to understand the rhythm and how long something like this can take. Anybody who's been in this area knows that sometimes these things don't even go away. I mean, they just hang out there, and they develop their own rhythm, their own cadence. Other times it can be a flash fire. It can come in very quickly. So you want to, before you are answering the question, why are we still talking about this 18 months later, and why have you spent all this money, you want to give them that heads up in advance. And with respect to the board, again, you're talking to them about the cadence. You see them once a quarter as opposed to regularly with management. So you'll want to train them in the same way and give them the advance notice about timing and what we're looking at. They're worried about risk, risk to the company, risk to themselves, and so you want to make sure that you're addressing those concerns when you brief them and when you educate them. You also want to ask them, because these days many board members sit on other boards, for their input. They may have seen other inquiries similar to this. How were they handled? So it's a real way actually to engage with your board, obviously working with your management to do so, to make sure that you're utilizing best practices.
Nancy, just curious, do you have experience with setting up protocols in advance for if an inquiry is going to come in, this is who we're going to escalate it to, this is the subset of the board we're going to talk to, this is how we're going to handle it? Is that something that you typically have gamed out in advance?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that question. It's very timely because our audit committee is meeting next week as part of our board week. And in fact, one of our topics of conversations is the revision to our protocols. We did have a set of protocols. We've been public for 5+ years. They came out around the time that we went public. And we have now, this is version 3.0, and we're getting a little bit more granular to the point where for this particular set, we're introducing the concept of what do you do if a senior member of management, what do you do if I, the GC, is named as a person of concern, and helping the board to understand what are the things that they should then do. What are the pathways that we should take if it is a senior member? We're pretty comfortable we know what to do if it's not one of the NEOs or the executive committee members, but we're just taking it the next step to be more clear.
Well, it sounds like preparation and education are absolutely the keys to being able to have a meaningful dialogue both with management and with the board in order to start on the right foot in handling one of these. Kim, let's talk about the next must-have, which is how does the company respond to an internal investigation?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we sort of, to be provocative, put on this slide that there is only one answer to a U.S. government request that a company conduct an internal investigation, and that answer is yes. That's not actually true. Of course, you can decline to cooperate, but I think strategically our point is it's almost always in the company's best interest to agree that the company will take its own look rather than immediately start with the government coming in and doing its own investigation. And when the government trusts you enough to do that, you're already starting with a good deal of credibility, and there's a lot of benefit to the company. First of all, you can control the investigation a lot more. You can control the timing, you can control the pace. It's less disruptive to have the company's own lawyers doing the investigation either internally or with outside counsel than it is to have the government sending subpoenas and calling in witnesses. And you can really develop a good rapport with the government that can serve you well later by conducting a credible investigation. And so strategically, it's almost always going to be beneficial to say yes when the government says, will you go off and look into this issue and report back to us? But of course, you could say no, and there might be situations in which you know, it's always a fact-specific question. But I think in general, there's just a lot of benefit to companies to doing their own investigation rather than having the government come in.
Just to emphasize that, having the government determine who will be talked to and when, aside from being obviously very nerve-wracking, is incredibly disruptive. And the management team that really should be focused on the business side of the business will be distracted by that. And so by being able to outline your protocols, your approach to the government and to management, and essentially acting as the go-between and having those sorted and organized, you can take into account things like, you know, board week next week, right? If somebody showed up next week, it would be a real problem for my company, just because we're all focused on that particular thing. So you can utilize that to your advantage, and it also, if you say yes, you do set up that credibility. You do set up that opportunity to have a discussion, which is, look, we're good corporate citizens. We understand you have a job to do here. Let's talk about what that is, and let's figure out how we can get you what you need with minimal disruption to us. And that's a really good way to start that conversation. And you can figure out if you have any leverage, which sounds like an odd thing to say, but if this is not a whistleblower that's unique to something that's going on in your organization, but it is a broader industry-based discussion, then you might be able to figure out, you know, where are you in their investigation or in their inquiry process? Are you the first one they're talking to? If so, they may be willing to share more with you to help get more information so they can pursue other organizations. And so you can by asking probing questions, you can figure out if you have any leverage points. We did have a question actually from someone previously asking if those who are being investigated can ask and expect an answer, and I would say yes. They may not give you, they don't have to, but it's always the right thing to do to ask those questions, specifically to make sure if you can figure out what your leverage points are and how to best manage it.
Yeah, I mean, they might not answer. They typically will have a bias toward protecting their sources, but in having that dialogue, you almost always learn something. And the more you talk to them, the more you start to learn about where their information is coming from. So you might not get that answer immediately, but the dialogue might reveal quite a bit.
And that leads naturally into the next question, which Kim, if you can start off, and Nancy, you can add too, is how do you scope one of these when you might not have all the facts? You might not know who the whistleblower is, if there's a whistleblower. You might not know really where the government is coming from or going to.
Of it. But there are a lot of questions that go into scoping the investigation. First of all, who's going to do the investigation? Or is it something that you're able to look at purely internally using your own in-house legal department, your own internal audit, any investigators you have on staff? There are investigations that can be completely appropriately addressed purely internally, but you do need to think about privilege issues, protecting privilege, whether there will be an additional helpful amount of credibility if you bring in an outside law firm or outside experts, and how to structure that approach. You need to think about what you are going to investigate. And I think this is really important. A number of government officials recently, Leslie Caldwell, the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division being one prominent example, had said they don't expect companies to boil the ocean. They don't expect companies to look at 40 countries, but to make smart strategic decisions about where you need to look. And taking, I always think of the investigation in sort of concentric circles. Start with the people and the transactions closest to the key conduct and move outward. And there's going to be a point where you, as long as you can defend what you've done and why it's sensible, you don't have to look under every single rock. But being able to explain why you made the choices you made is really important in dealing with the government.
Yeah, I think that's crucial, Kim. I will tell people this is an investigation. It's not the Spanish Inquisition. You have to have some measure over the breadth of what you're going to do, because otherwise it does feel like a witch hunt, and that obviously has a very concerning impact on the business, and arguably doesn't add a whole lot to the government's investigation, depending on what they're looking for. I think the other thing too is to figure out, internally, what resources you're using, but also what leadership you need to work with. Is this something that the audit committee needs to be actively involved in? Is this something that should rise to the level of the general counsel, or should she be involved in it? Or is this something that's more ordinary course? As a government contractor, you mentioned earlier, we get inquiries with some regularity that are nothing in the scheme of things, and so those are handled in the ordinary course. To figure that out, and being fluid or reactive to wherever the investigation takes you. You can't be a slave to your scope. You have to be able to be responsive to the findings that you come across. So your visual of concentric circles or a broadening circle is absolutely appropriate. And so you need to make sure that the right folks are there to make sure that those triggers are pulled.
That's a very good and subtle point. And so let me follow up on that. Nancy and Kim. What if you have a desperate whistleblower who, when the company looks at the allegations, doesn't find anything, goes back to the government, says, you know, we've looked at this, we've reviewed records, we're not finding the smoking gun. And then the whistleblower says, well, look here and look there and dig up the rest of the backyard because I know there's a body buried somewhere. And the government plays along with that. How do you, probably as a result of Madoff, how do you set some limits and how do you push back?
That's a tough one because I think you do see it, and it's almost personality dependent based on who the investigator or who the person in the government is. One of the things that I would do is I would actually turn to outside counsel that has some credibility with the investigating agency, and say, look, I've bared everything we can to our outside counsel. They are helping to make a judgment on the fact that there's not only are there no bodies in the backyard, we don't have a backyard left. We've dug it all up. And so in effect, you're utilizing the credibility that Kim Parker brings to the investigation. And you want to target it to folks who have previous relationships with whatever that agency or that organization is. So knowing who those folks are is very important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it can be really frustrating, and I think we've all three of us experienced this. It feels like a game of whack-a-mole. Like you get one allegation, you run it down, it doesn't pan out, but next thing you know, it pops up and they're asking you about something else. But I do think there's value in getting some credibility with some of those first few, so that you undermine the government's confidence in their source. And so the more, fairly early on, you can show that certain things that their source is telling them are just wrong, that you can demonstrate that, you really start to undercut their confidence in their source. And even though they're probably going to go a couple rounds before they're willing to put something to bed, you do benefit from that pattern and being able to show a pattern of misinformation from their whistleblower and their source. So you sort of got to have that patience to keep at it. But it can be one of the more frustrating parts of these inquiries.
And that's an attention to detail that I think having people who know the business as well as know the law is crucial to have as part of the investigation. It could be something as minor as an allegation that someone was violating expense reporting or time reporting, some kind of activity that had a geolocation. And so that you can actually go into records and prove that, this individual who allegedly the wrongdoer was in fact not even in the country. But unless you know how to find those records and what you should be looking for, you can take longer to get to the right answer. We've all been in the same circumstance where at one point or another we were able to essentially prove up that either the whistleblower didn't know what they were talking about or they had a personal vendetta. Somewhere along the way, any one of your investigations, Kim, or any one of mine, and yours too, Susan. So, I think it is that credibility. They are relying on the credibility of their witness, and we're relying on the credibility of not only our business, but also, outside counsel and the internal counsel who go to the table.
And one other thing sorry, Susan. One other thing I was going to say on scoping is, you don't have to agree to everything the government asks you to do. And I think reasonable requests obviously make sense, but it can be a back and forth. And it can be a process of saying, not necessarily no, we'll never look at that, but why don't we table it while we look at something else and then decide later if that's something you really need us to do. So understanding that it's not a one-way thing, that you have to do everything they tell you or ask you to do, but that it can be an iterative process.
Good point. And Nancy, what you were just describing too is essentially proving a negative to the government, and that's got to be frustrating for the board and for management. So do you want to talk about how you sort of bring them along as the investigation unfolds and it hits some of these really frustrating patches like we were just talking about?
Absolutely, and it is incredibly frustrating because you are being asked to prove a negative. And I think if you're dealing with senior management, they obviously have significant belief in their colleagues and significant belief in their organization. And so for them, it's so obvious. And so you have to take them down the path so that they understand the process and what we have to do in order to go through and clarify or make others believe as we do. So, the clarity about what we're doing, how we're doing it, what the time frame is, it's something that I will share with the management and board, and again, ask them for their input. Make it very clear that they don't have the ability to do the investigation themselves, that it's being run for my team, but make sure that they understand with that absolute clarity and they understand the cadence of it, that we're consistent, both from within the one investigation itself, that we take the same approach, that we do it repeatedly, but also from investigation to investigation. If you have multiple inquiries, they want to be able to rely on you to know that you're going to think of all things. And so I literally start out by telling them that my first inquiries are the 6 reporter questions. I start with who, what, why, when, where, and how. And I say that's where we start. It's very basic, and we'll go from there, even into very complex things. If you can bring your management back to those 6 questions, they'll at least understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. I'll also talk to them about the long term. So they'll understand the problem. They'll see what is being looked at, and I will go out a little bit on a limb with them to help them understand where I think this is going. And I'll do it in a way such that I'm not predicting the future, but what it is I'm presenting the problem and giving them somewhat of a solution so that they know, what the best case could be, and indeed I'll give them a heads up on what the worst case could be. So much of these things can turn political, can be about leverage, and so you want to make sure that you keep that as part of the discussion process with them. Again, management, as I said before, management and board are different in how much detail you provide, when you provide it. Typically, for me, management tends to be an ongoing discussion. I set up regular meetings to talk it through. I make sure that the right people are in the room at the same time, which is a little bit of a challenge, getting everybody's calendar. But that's so that they can feed questions off each other and so that they understand, what other members of management are concerned about, and they can build that into their own thought processes. With the board, unless there's something huge and gigantic, I will wait for regular board meetings. And indeed, sometimes I will ask for an executive session. Just as a best practice, I would suggest that having the ability for a general counsel to have executive session every time, whether or not you use it or not, I think is important. What you don't want is the circumstance where you have the unusual request of an executive session with the board and everybody panics because, oh no, the general counsel's now asked for an executive session. You want to have that as part of your regular practice. And then, you talk to them about the regular processes and how you're going to do things, and you get their buy-in from it.
I can see why you want all those awards. It's quite an art form as well as legal practice. Well, let's take it down to the nitty-gritty on the next must-have and talk about the steps that you absolutely have to take when one of these comes up, because the timing of those I know is critical. Nancy, you want to talk about those?
Sure. The one thing that's not on there that should be on there is hire really smart people who know this better than you do, because you're going to be relying on them for sure. That's both internal and external. And the definition of a general counsel is literally someone who knows how to spot issues, but I don't do this nearly as well as my team does it internally, and I rely on them, and I rely on my outside counsel. So make sure you know who your experts are, and make sure you have them on speed dial. Working with them, you will establish the scope of the investigation, and one of the first, once you've done that, is your document preservation. You have to get that done immediately, if not sooner, and you have to get it done right. Your IT imaging, our information in every organization is all over the place, and so you really need to be thinking as broadly as possible. You always start with the individuals who are immediately involved, but at any one point in time, I can guarantee you it expands. And so you need to be able to be ready for that and make sure that your processes are up to date and up to speed. This is not an area you really want to skimp in. Cost savings will cost you, more in the long run if you don't do it right. You have to make sure nothing is lost. You have to make sure it's accessible. And you need to be able to talk through, what your capabilities are and what you're going to go buy if you don't have those capabilities in-house. You need to work very carefully with HR to make sure that you and the team that's working on it and everyone else who touches it are fully reminded of the policies regarding non-retaliation. Fortunately, I don't think that that's something that my company does on a regular basis, if at all, but having those kinds of reminders right then and there is best practice. And so you'll want to work with HR and the team to make sure that everyone is reminded of those. You will want to work with HR to minimize the people impact, so making sure you know where people are and how to get hold of them, and not be flagged as a witness. You don't want to set up in the middle of the hallway and invite people to the conference room, for example, and have them come out white-faced and ashen. So you'll need to work with your teams to make sure that is done appropriately. Those are some of the immediate things that come to mind. Kim, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with all those. I think one key thing, I know, Susan, you always used to say this, is stop the bleeding immediately. So before you can figure out what happened, you have to make sure that if something bad's happening, it's not continuing to happen while you're trying to get the investigation organized. So that means very quickly, first of all, preserving the data so you don't lose any of it, but also if there is a particular third-party relationship that is suspect, making sure you're not sending out more payments to that same third party in the middle of the investigation. So you sort of freeze everything in the status quo so that you don't make things worse before you can figure out if there's actually a problem. And taking quick action to preserve the status quo is really important. It may turn out to be nothing and you can resume those payments, but the last thing you want is to have compounded the problem by having the problem continue, the same suspect employee authorizing bad transactions while you're still getting your arms around the investigation scope.
Yeah, good point. Or if you've got a fraud going on, and it turns out that there is something going on, making sure that you stop that as soon as you can obviously makes a good deal of sense. Well, Kim, let me turn it over to you for a minute, and because I know you've interviewed many senior executives, talk a little bit about that, because that's clearly a very sensitive area and one that the company has to get right.
Yeah, and I think, interviews in general are a critical piece of any investigation, but there are some very specific considerations when you're interviewing senior executives. First of all, there is internal, there's always diplomacy within the company when you are reaching out to senior executives, making sure the right people are informed, that you have very senior lawyers, whether it's the general counsel or someone else, who are helping you navigate the approach to the senior executives, that you think through very carefully whether they should have their own lawyer, whether they need their own lawyer, whether it's something that you want to make available to them is extremely important to think about, but also making clear that they owe a duty to the company to cooperate and to provide information, and that the company expects that they are going to do that. So sort of making clear those reciprocal duties, the duty that you owe them to make sure that they are prepared and protected, but also the duty that they owe to the company to provide complete cooperation in an investigation is really critical.
And this can be one of the trickiest parts of the whole thing because of who's involved. And for many folks, you don't find anything. It's just an investigation. What we would consider just an investigation, to them it's a personal affront that anyone would accuse them or believe that they could be affiliated in some way with an issue. This is compounded most recently by the Yates memo, where they've come across and said, we're going to hold individuals personally accountable. And all of my senior executives read the Wall Street Journal, and so they're wondering, what does that mean for them? And I know that it's a huge topic of conversation in Kim's circles and my circles about, do you change your Upjohn type warnings to your senior exec or to your executives when you interview them? How do you approach it? I don't think, Kim, we've not yet resolved that within the practice community, but it's certainly something that we need to be thinking about and are. And I think there's going to be an increased level of discomfort on the part of these folks who you really need to cooperate with you and who want to, but want to know what's going to happen to them on Monday. So it's that delicate dance, it's that delicate balance. And again, it goes to the credibility. The reason I have senior folks in the room, it goes to the credibility. They want to know that somebody's seen this rodeo before and are thinking about it in a level-headed fashion, have the relationships, have the thought processes and the judgment to help them and the company get through it. It's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I think just to back up on the Yates memo to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about, there was recently in September a memo issued by the Deputy Attorney General, Sally Yates, stating that it will be a condition of cooperation that companies cooperate by providing evidence on individual wrongdoers. And that had frankly long been the policy at the Justice Department, but it was made more formal in this memo and really emphasized much more than it had been before that you cannot get cooperation credit as a company unless you are providing all relevant information against individual wrongdoers. And there is a question about how that, if at all, changes the dynamic of internal investigations, whether when you're giving the traditional so-called Upjohn warnings at the beginning of an interview, whether you need to be telling your witness not only that the company may provide information to the government, but that it will provide information, and whether that affects the cooperation that you're going to get. So there's been quite a bit of debate about that, and I think the main takeaway is there is a considerable focus at the law enforcement level on individuals, and that can affect the dynamic of your interviews.
How do you decide when you're going to go back to the government and interact with them? I think that's a tricky strategic call.
Yeah, it is. And again, this is another one where it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all approach, because in some investigations you may have the luxury and the ability to wait till you're completely done before you make a presentation. In others, they're going to expect interim reports on what you're learning, and there can be different strategic considerations depending on the type of inquiry that it is. But I think one takeaway is just you have to think very carefully about the timing and the strategy of when you're going to go back and report to the government, and it has to be a consideration that's specific to the facts and circumstances. But one of the things that I always say is that your most critical asset in these circumstances is your credibility. And so the government has come to the company and said, will you as a company look into this and report back to us. That's a vote of confidence in the company, and it's important not to squander that, and that means if you find things that are problematic, you can't pull punches. You've got to be open about them, but that doesn't mean that there's no room for advocacy and context, and making sure you're balancing your credibility, which is the most important thing, never to lose credibility, but also to know where it's appropriate to bring in that advocacy and that context, even to facts that can sometimes turn out to be bad.
And that is a huge element in choosing what counsel do the interviews, what counsel does the investigation, whether it's internal or external. Having those, and they can sometimes be very heated discussions about what is acting as an appropriate advocate versus what is the responsibility to come forward to make sure that your credibility is preserved. And their outside counsel are all across the board on this. You know, there are some folks who still think they're in the government, and you want to make sure that you know that before you hire them, because their judgment will be there's no room for advocacy. Fortunately, Kim is not one of them, to be sure. But I think it's very important that you have that open dialogue with the decision makers when you are trying to determine to what extent do you bring forward, to what information you bring forward, to what extent is it a voluntary disclosure, how far are you going to take something. And sometimes locking people in a conference room until the coffee runs out is how you get to the right answer.
Well, and what I hear you both saying is you have to tell the truth. And I know you both, and I know that's where you come from, but you can also present the truth in ways that are strategic and that involve advocacy and that involve context. And I think, you know, that makes a great deal of sense in terms of interacting with the government. And I
Absolutely.
think
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say absolutely. And you also need to do it, as you said, Susan, in context. One of the things that's most important is if you do have an issue, you need to be able to present to the government or the inquirer what you've done to stop it, what you were doing right that very minute to address the risk, so that you can say that there's really nothing further for the government to do, because in their interest, it's to get an issue resolved, or that's what their interest should be. And so that's also part of the conversation, of the context.
That's a good point, because something may have occurred 9 years ago, or before a company went public, or in the context of an acquisition, and have been resolved subsequently. And that's, there's no there anymore. And being able to establish that context, I think, can really help move people, off of that particular issue. Kim, any thoughts about? We've talked about timing and strategy, presentation style before we move off this. I'm sorry. Yeah, we're on that slide. Before we go to the next. Do you always bring people in from the company? Do you bring business people in? Do you only bring in the lawyers? Let's talk about that a little bit, because I think we've got enough time.
I never want to say I always do one thing or another, but in general, I think it is typically most effective if you have someone from the company there. So if it's not only outside counsel. And I just think there's nothing like the government being able to turn and look someone in the eye who's at the company, who's trying to do the right thing, and to be able to get a sense of that commitment. And I think it's typically helpful to have either the chief compliance officer or someone who can talk, as Nancy just said, about what's happening right now in the company that would prevent whatever the issue is that's being looked at. What new policies and procedures and controls does the company have in place? I think it's usually just very effective to have someone from the company there to be able to carry that message in a way that outside counsel typically can't nearly as effectively.
And what about leaving a slide presentation? What about doing a slide presentation? And what about leaving it with the government after a status meeting or update?
Yeah, this is another one where there's a lot of debate about how to approach it, and it may be different in different cases. I do think that slide presentations can be effective. It's a good way for the government to, first of all, see how much work you've done. You can catalog and summarize the thoroughness of the investigation and convey it in the slides, which I think is very helpful for the credibility of what you've done and to give the government comfort that you've really looked hard at the issues. It's also a good way to present documents, pictures of emails, documents on slides, again, to give some meat and some teeth to what you've done in the investigation, the transactions that you've looked at, what the documents themselves say. I think it's effective to be able to do that visually. Usually the government wants to be able to keep the slides if you bring them in, and I certainly have had cases where we've tried to avoid that, either because we had concerns about FOIA requests or privilege requests, but I usually go in assuming that we're going to leave them behind, and that way the government representatives can take notes on them and really sort of touch and feel the investigation.
Makes sense.
If you're going to do that, you want to, of course, it goes without saying, but you're going to want to have the conversation about privilege and how you address that. That's a whole other topic that you could spend an hour on, but I would just add it.
Exactly.
Well, I'll talk about a little bit about that on the next must-have, which is avoiding common pitfalls and mistakes.
Yeah, I think the three things that I put there are for me the top in the list, right? Conducting the investigation in an insular fashion, just kind of having the team go off and do it without having the touch points either back to senior leadership, back to management of the company, indeed not having touch points into the government. As Kim mentioned, every conversation you have with them, if done artfully, you find out more about what they're looking for and why they're looking for it. So making sure that you build this as that virtuous circle with the appropriate touch points to the various parts of the organization, including HR and finance if necessary, et cetera. So don't be insular about how you do it. This isn't about taking a problem and coming up with the solution all by yourself. This is by definition a team sport. I already mentioned the Spanish Inquisition. This is something where you just keep pulling the thread and the thread and the thread until you get to the nth degree. At some point, you need to make a judgment call as to diminishing returns. And you want to do that because, A, this is not the business of your company. The business of your company is the business of your company. You want to be focused on that. And B, as long as you are doing what is expected and you are turning over all the likely rocks, you don't have to turn over all the rocks. As Kim already mentioned, the government doesn't expect you to boil the ocean. And so I think doing that on your own is a misuse of assets and resources. And then the scope creep, going from an area that you've all agreed, and even though I did say follow the investigation and see where it goes, if you have other things that you're concerned about, you want to follow those up, but you don't want to necessarily make them part of an investigation. For example, if you discover that there are folks who are having expense issues, but that's not the focus of the investigation, you create that separately. That's not within your original scope. You look at that in a separate fashion and keep focused on the original scope that the government is concerned about. If you find something else new that needs to be reported to the government or shared with the government, you can make that assessment, but be very cognizant of your scope. And then I think the last thing is not wrapping it up. Either not wrapping it up with management or going back to the whistleblower if you know who that person is, not having a conclusion. That won't always be within your control if you're talking to the government. I know that there are Fortune 100 companies out there who have things disclosed on their 10Ks and have had for the last 5 years because the government has just not gotten back to them on it. So if it's within your ability to close it out, do so. If the government's hanging on to it, well, you just have to keep it, as part of your regular cadence and governance process, and so be it.
That takes us to our last slide, which is a very helpful tee-up for bringing it to a close internally, which you've just talked about. Kim, we've got a minute or two left. You want to talk about bringing it to a close externally with the government?
Yeah, this is one where it can be frustrating because this is something very much not in your control. You can't typically make the government close a case, and it can sometimes be frustrating because cases can languish out there, and you don't get that closure. And so this can sometimes be one of the most frustrating things for management, to understand that there is just a limit to your power in getting the government to close investigations. Having said that, there are things you can try to do. Number one, make sure you are responsive to their requests, so that if the government has pending items, that you're getting back to them promptly, that whatever is holding them up isn't something that's on your plate. And then something we talked about earlier, which is really being, if you can, to undermine their confidence in their whistleblower, in their source, so that if there is a new issue that same source raises, they're less apt to think, well, this is something we absolutely have to run down because the prior things didn't pan out. And so really doing what you can to tie off those other loose ends, no matter how minor they are, each thing chips away at their confidence in their source. That helps to bring things to a conclusion.
Good point. Well, we've brought the webinar to a conclusion too, and all I can say is I wish we had done this many years ago, because the shared insights and the shared wisdom, it's really helpful, I think, to everybody, both in dealing with an issue that can be very, very difficult for management, for legal, and for outside counsel, and also dealing with it successfully and really as an art form, not just as a legal matter. So I want to thank both Kim and Nancy. It's really been a pleasure spending this hour with you, and thank Tom for having Litigation Conferences sponsor this webinar.
You're welcome, Susan. And we just ask that if you have, we ask if you could please take our survey. As I said before, we're working with Susan on this series, HB compliance conferences with Susan Frank Devers, and so we take those to heart, and we'll use those to plan our upcoming events and select speakers and topics and things like that. So if you could take a moment, your time won't be wasted. So we look forward to working with you all again. So thank you, Susan. It's been a pleasure to work with you twice this week on educating people on compliance issues. Thanks also to LRN for some promotional support announcing this program. So we welcome LRN participants and LRN customers who signed up as well. So welcome to them. And Nancy and Kim, it was a pleasure to work with you both. And with that, the conference or the seminar is adjourned. Thank you.